Cauliflower gawked at Ahalamin's royal princess while she engaged in the worst temper tantrum he had ever witnessed. Oily slime dripped from her nose and chin. Her verbal threats, promising diabolical forms of torture, rivaled the roar of jet engines. Rashid approached, limping pitiably. Cauliflower knew his head was in jeopardy again, but he could not mask the amusement in his voice. Gesturing toward Victoria, he questioned Rashid. Does this belong to you, my lord? Perhaps you require some assistance? Cauliflower watched Rashid scoop up his wife in silent ruthlessness and then give him a look that would be credited to an executioner. Ahalamin's princess fought like a newly caged tiger, trying in vain to dislodge herself from her husband's arms. Cauliflower admired her courage. He knew strong, hardened men who would not dare to provoke Rashid's anger. However, his new princess did not seem to know she should be afraid. His princess shot him an accusing stare. I don't belong to anyone, she shouted at him. I demand you make this fool release me. Don't just stand there, do something. Do you wish to release the princess, my lord? Cauliflower asked with just a hint of impertinence. She does not seem much taken with you at the moment. Rashid snarled an unintelligible reply and tossed Victoria through the air. Cauliflower scrambled to make the catch, nearly dropping her in the shock of the moment. To lay one's hands on another man's wife, especially a royal wife, was unlawful, unthinkable. Rashid snarled. She is in need of a protector. If you do not remove her from my sight, I will administer the punishment she deserves. My lord? Please, Cauliflower, just do as I ask. For her safety, secure her in my compartment. Cauliflower had seen Rashid angry before, but never had he seen his control reduced to mere threads. He nodded in wise submission to Rashid's request. The startling flight from the arms of one captor to another dumbfounded Victoria. Exhausted, mentally and physically, she barely noticed when Cauliflower stood her on her feet at the bottom of the loading ramp and led her onto the waiting plane. Princess, I believe you will find everything you need to refresh yourself in the adjoining compartment. His composed manner, reassuring calm, impelled her along, and she followed him through the lounge and into a private compartment. The telephone on the side table connects to the seating area we just passed through. You may communicate any additional services you require. This man was not as overbearing or threatening as Rashid. Perhaps he would listen to her. Who are you? Why are you helping him? Don't you understand? I don't belong here or to him. If you really want to be of service, get me away from him. Excuse me, Princess. I should have introduced myself at once. I am Cauliflower, Prince Devar's first regent and loyal servant. As to where you belong, this is for your husband to decide. But he's not my husband. I didn't agree to this. Please take time to refresh yourself and rest. Prince Devar will be here soon to calm your fears. Victoria stared in dismay as Cauliflower bowed and backed through the door. Dizzy and weak, she scanned the room for somewhere to sit. A massive round bed dominated the small area. Its black satin coverlet, mounted with pillows of red, gold, and ivory, Electric candle sconces lit up the mirrored walls. The woman in the mirror posed a ghastly sight. The oversized robe hung on her like a tent, giving her the appearance of a war-weary refugee. Something else reflected in the mirror. Draped across the edge of the bed was an emerald diaphanous nightgown. Surely there was no equal to its exquisite beauty. A heated blush crept up her cheeks at the dawning realization the gown was intended for her. The man possessed an unlimited supply of unmitigated gall. The only way he would see her in the sensual creation was if he buried her in it. Flooded with a renewed contempt for his pig-headed arrogance, she decided to confront him face to face. She'd walked onto this plane on her own 2 feet, and she could walk off the same way. Stalking back to the door, she grabbed the handle and yanked. Nothing happened. She pulled harder, twisting the knob in both directions. Rage kept her from giving in to the faintness causing her to sway. The door under her hands took on the character of her abductor. She assaulted it with her fists. To hold back the compulsion to plead, she shouted murder and mayhem instead. Rashid cursed himself, the stubborn she-camel in his sleeping compartments, and everything else connected to his wedding day. How could one pocket-sized woman do what no man dared? In the matter of a few hours, she had insulted, humiliated, defied, and attacked him. Instead of relaxing in quiet luxury with his bride, he was walking a dirty, stinking tarmac in the middle of the night. Both hands reached to massage the corded muscles in his neck. Squeezing his eyes shut, he summoned the rigid discipline he valued. Control and direction were principles taught by his father. Self-discipline and strength of will were lessons a 15-year-old ruler had learned by necessity. He would not allow this woman to disturb his balance again. With his mind resolved, tense muscles began to quiver and release. The new calmness soaked through his body. He was ready. The rest of this night would go according to plan, his plan. His powerful gait took him toward the waiting aircraft, where he found Cauliflower and his 2 bodyguards loitering at the bottom of the stairway. "Why are you not inside? Is the pilot not ready to leave?" With a wry expression, Cauliflower answered, "My lord, there is a small problem in the cabin. The noise level is, well, perhaps you would like to hear for yourself." Rashid took the stairs 2 at a time. Identifying the source of the problem did not take long. The verbal tirade echoing through the lounge came from his private compartment at the end of the plane. "Let me out of here. I'm an American citizen, and this is kidnapping. I'll have you all arrested and executed for this. I'm warning you, Cauliflower. You tell that unscrupulous, deceitful desert creep to get back here and let me go." Rashid took a step forward and then paused. The sudden cessation of verbal ranting was more unnerving than the previous clamor. The pregnant silence made the hairs on his arms stand erect. With this woman, he was certain the calm was a precursor to worse atrocities. He hoped he was wrong, and she had exhausted her foul temper instead. The thud of a solid object slamming against the other side of the door ridiculed his supposed control. He yanked off his robe and headdress, slinging them toward the back of a chair. He barked a command to his 2 bodyguards. "Give the pilot orders to depart now." Both went forward to deliver the message, almost jamming the small doorway in their attempt to pass through at the same time. Consumed with his own anger, he could not find any humor in the speed with which they fled one loud but small woman. He wondered about the quality of his personal security. Spearing Cauliflower with a glacial look, he motioned him forward. You will ignore any sound you hear from the other side of that door. Understood? May I speak frankly, my lord? Rashid stiffened. If you must. This woman that you've made your wife is a stranger to you and to our customs. These are extreme circumstances for her. Despite her less than respectful manner, she is still deserving of the gentle persuasion you always accord the women in your life. Are you telling me how to treat my wife? Rashid lashed in reply. As your servant, never, replied Cauliflower. As your friend, I simply offer a reminder. Guard well your actions this night, and remember with what care you have always protected what is yours. I will deal with the princess in whatever manner suits me, growled Rashid. As you say. Cauliflower tipped his head in acceptance. Do you wish to proceed directly to the palace upon our arrival? No. Call ahead. Set up camp at the oasis of the moon. Invite the tribesmen of Torak and Balthazar to join us. We still have unfinished business to settle. And the princess? The princess will most definitely accompany me. I will make the preparations as you ask. Most definitely, Rashid muttered with a brooding frown. His wife would learn what generations of women in his country had always known. Her needs, indeed her very survival, rested in the hands of her husband, his hands. His willful wife would learn that a woman needed the protection and leadership of a man, whether she lived in a Bedouin tent, a New York penthouse, or the royal palace of Ahalamin. A jarring movement under his feet signaled the pilot's approach to the runway. The raised level of his wife's voice as she renewed her threats indicated her awareness as well. If she did not cease soon, she was going to make herself sick. Striding forward, he unlocked the door, swung it open, and then slammed it shut behind him. Silence! His startled wife leapt backward and stood silent and motionless a few feet from him. Rashid surveyed his surroundings. Anything not bolted down had been used as a battering ram. The inner panel of the door, damaged beyond repair, would require a complete replacement. His wife looked no better. Head to foot, she was covered in dirt and oil. Her robe lay in a heap by his feet. The sheer fabric covering her legs, wet and transparent, clung revealingly. Her head covering sat askew, and the tapering veils hung heavily to one side. She should have been repulsive, but in fact, no woman had ever been more beautiful or provocative. The brown streaks on her cheeks accentuated their ivory perfection. Her moist lashes framed eyes weary from struggling against the inevitable. He wanted to lay her down, to caress away the fatigue, kiss away the fear, and awaken her desire. His frustration and anger now partnered with the heat of sexual arousal left him stunned, powerless in its grip. He craved two things. He wanted her, and he wanted her willing and ready. In self-disparagement, he threw back his head and groaned. He could sooner shift the desert sands than induce a willing response from the little she-devil in front of him. He studied the pale beauty, spitting daggers at him with her eyes. He could take what he wanted. It was his. But the taking would not be nearly enough. He wanted more, much more. He wanted her to crave his touch, to know the helpless, agonizing hunger tormenting him. He wanted to dominate her every thought as she did his. The conquest would test the limits of his control, but he would have this woman on his terms. He lifted the corner of his mouth in a confident smile as he watched his wife wrap her arms around her upper body. Glaring at him with the light of battle in her eyes, she waited for his next move. Until the plane began to taxi, Victoria believed in the deepest part of her soul that Rashid would let her go. After all, weren't damsels in distress always rescued? Not all damsels, apparently. Her airborne prison was gaining altitude, and she was losing her freedom with each ascending foot. Rashid's presence dominated the small compartment. The firm set of his jaw, despite his smile, abolished any hope of reprieve. The room sizzled with his energy. Coupled with his size and strength, how was she supposed to defend herself? You are in need of a bath, Princess. The unexpected comment shocked her, as if he'd slung a glass of ice water in her face. She darted her eyes toward the door. The door is not locked. I have no need of such assistance. We are several thousand feet over a very deep and cold ocean. There is no place to run, and no one who will assist you. You may have me at a disadvantage. Victoria put as much contempt into her words as possible. But this does not mean I have to stay in the same space and breathe the same air as you. We have a language problem, Princess. Let me make myself clear. When translated properly, my words, you are in need of a bath, are understood to mean you will do as I ask in this matter. No need of a lock means if you step 1 inch outside this room before I give you permission, you will definitely not like the consequences. Victoria itemized those possible consequences as Rashid walked past her into what she supposed was a bath and dressing area. She heard the sound of running water and an inescapable voice. Victoria, come in here, please. Every item on her list suddenly seemed preferable to surrender. She opted for the unknown as she inched in the opposite direction. No way was she going to take a bath with the most unpredictable man ever acting as her personal attendant. A prickly sensation crawled up the back of her neck, and goosebumps roughened the landscape of her arms. Turning to check behind her was a mistake. He stood, arms crossed, nonchalantly leaning against the arched doorway of the bath area. She had seen that arrogant pose before, and she detested it. He waited for her to make the unforgivable error of thwarting his orders as he could enforce his hateful dominance. One more thing, Princess. I never lie to a woman. Foot tapping, hands on her hips, she took up the challenge. I don't want a bath, and I don't like being threatened either. I'm not a child you can scold and punish at will. Then do not act like one. Only a child would scorn a necessary bath. Why don't you find a parachute and take a flying leap? Better yet, forget the parachute. He advanced on her. I'm getting very tired of your viper's tongue, woman. As your husband, you will speak to me with civility and respect. This I demand and I will have from you. The black fire leaping from his eyes torched the edge of her courage. Only a breath of distance separated her from the explosive temper highlighting the color in his face. His accent deepened, as did his voice. You believe me to be uncivilized, beneath your contempt. A desert creep were your exact words. He lifted his head, and aiming his next words down his autocratic nose, issued an imperial command. This term is unacceptable. Never dare to use it again. Be warned, princess. You have no idea of the savagery you can provoke. Her whole life had been spent contending with men who relied on their supposed superior intelligence and unquestionable authority. She was sick of them, most especially the oversized dragon threatening her with his fiery retribution. Casting caution to the wind, she hurled an impressive set of threats of her own. Her feet suddenly left the floor as he jerked her toward him. Another forceful tug in the room spun out of control as he swiftly turned her and yanked apart the row of buttons at the back of her minuscule vest. Victoria let out an ear-piercing scream and clutched the now loosened top to her breast. Her world rotated again as he spun her back in his direction. She kicked. Agonizing pain shot up her foot as she connected with some part of his anatomy. Cold metal slid along her back as he lifted her against the door and used the full length of his body to pin her in place. Every shaking part of her was wedged between the unyielding door and his hard, angry body. She wanted to scream, but there was no air in her lungs. She tried to read the intent in his eyes, but their narrow tightness prevented her access. His mouth swooped to crush the softness of hers. She clamped her lips tight. He pulled back and stared down at her with a mocking smirk. Then, pushing her chin up, he lowered his mouth to hers again. The sharp edge of his teeth stung as he tugged on her mutinous bottom lip. She gasped in scandalized outrage. He invaded her mouth. No longer concerned with the garment she barely wore, she locked her fingers in his hair instead, pulling without concern for the pain she inflicted, fighting to pry his mouth from hers. His response was immediate and lethal. Lifting her higher, he parted her legs with his muscular thighs, then let her body weight rest on them, effectively immobilizing her and freeing his own hands. He pried her fingers from his hair and captured both her hands in one of his, lifting them and pinning them over her head. Filling his other hand with her hair, he tugged until she was forced to tilt her head and give him unrestricted access. Like an ancient explorer, he examined every inch of new territory and marked it as his own. Terrified of the savage lust she'd triggered, Victoria whimpered like a child. She stopped struggling, realizing on some level that she was fueling his determination to overcome her resistance. Humiliating, traitorous tears slid down her cheek. She hated him, but she hated herself more. With his masculinity, he destroyed her confidence, torn through her defenses, until he had reached a core of sensuality so alien it terrified her. Why now, in this vortex of violent emotion, did she want to surrender? Fearful as she was, a stronger need prevailed. She wanted to know, could she entice this man? Could she channel the awesome force of his raw power, gentle him with a willing response? Would he allow her, A mere woman, such sensual mastery as he exerted over her now? The clawing need ripped through her heart, stinging and hurting her. She was more afraid than she'd ever been in her life, vulnerable and weak in ways she didn't understand. Her own misery defeated her. The woman in his arms ceased to struggle and sagged against him. Awareness penetrated his crazed passion. The salty taste of tears surprised him. Her tears. He lifted his head little by little. She stared at him through wide, glistening eyes. He could see all the way to her soul, and her fear gutted him. He shuddered in revulsion. The scene sickened him. Damn his temper and impatience. How could he use his strength to subjugate and force her compliance? With her tiny wrist imprisoned above her head, he had earned the label which she'd thrown at him earlier, beast. He would take his whip to any men who so abused a woman. She could not know, but the fear in her eyes lashed him as deeply as the bite of any whip. She trembled, but didn't move or utter a sound. Where did he go from here? He was sure, being accustomed to wielding authority herself, she would interpret any weakening on his part as a victory. For both their sakes, he dared not relent until she accepted the fact she was his wife, and therefore subject to his will. He removed his legs from between hers and lowered her to a standing position, easing but not relinquishing the grip he held on her suspended wrists. Sliding his other hand from her hair, he lifted her chin with a slow, gentle pressure. Look at me, Victoria. She raised her tear-stained eyes, darkened by bewilderment. They were shadowed and shuddered against him. He softened his voice. Know this, Victoria. You are at this moment two things by right of this marriage: the royal Princess of Ahalamin and my wife. Our relationship balances on an unchangeable truth. One of us is born to complement and nurture, the other to lead and protect. The ageless reality is this: you can never match my strength or my will. Submit, and I will not insist. Yield, and I will not take. In this way, we will achieve a harmonious union, which will bring us both contentment and ease. He released her hands. Stepping away from her, took the last of his strength. She followed his movements with her eyes, wary of what he might do next. Her hands clutched the slipping remnants of her costume, while her shoulders slumped in exhaustion. Her eyes misted and lowered. She was temptation personified. He brushed a swath of curls from her face. She stood quiet and unmoving, allowing his touch. He dried the last remnant of a tear from her cheek with the back of his hand. I am going to the outer lounge to take care of some matters which need my attention. There is a fully equipped bath through the archway. No one will disturb your privacy. Relax and refresh yourself. When you have finished, I will have food prepared. Then we will talk. Cupping her face in his hands, he caressed her lips with his thumbs. She leaned ever so slightly against their pressure, a fact he knew would mortify her if she were aware of it. He lowered his hands and turned toward the door, forcing himself to leave her before he proved himself a liar as well as a beast. His stride took him to his target, the lounge bar. He poured and drowned 2 glasses of wine in quick succession when he filled the glass a third time. Alcohol was not a part of his cultural heritage, but he was the product of 2 nationalities. His mother was French. Although he thought of himself as a man of the desert, sometimes his mother's influence surfaced. Her father had worked for one of the most celebrated wineries in France, and she grew up loving the vineyards and wines. Rashid's father permitted her, in the privacy of her own rooms, to indulge that part of her culture. Whether or not his father knew, his wife on occasion encouraged her son to taste the new vintages she imported, Rashid did not know, but he thought the prospect highly unlikely. He stood head down, hands braced on the cabinet, and listened to the hum of the jet engines. The steady, rhythmic vibrations soothed the tension in his muscles. His 2 bodyguards were not in sight. They probably thought it a good idea to find some respite and sleep. Securing his glass, he crossed the lounge and took the seat opposite Cauliflower. Although his friend's eyes were closed, Rashid knew he was not asleep. He was more likely thanking heaven for the blessed silence, especially after Victoria's door-piercing scream. For sure, neither he nor Cauliflower had ever lived such a day. Lines had been crossed, customs shattered, and boundaries tested in unthinkable ways. As a man, he had come up short. He swirled the dark red liquid in his glass and then savored the last swallow, letting its warmth clear away the knot in his throat, if not the guilt eating at his conscience. A deep, contemplating sigh narrowed his attention on Cauliflower. In his regent's eyes lurked an unspoken question. Deciding someone ought to have some peace of mind, Rashid answered it. The princess is shaken but unharmed. My honor is, I never for one moment doubted your honor, my lord. I have never set for myself a more difficult task. I acquired what I set out to possess. However, what I possess is even now plotting how to drown me in the ocean below. A fact which will amuse you, I am sure. Rashid could not believe his ears. Unrestrained laughter burst forth from Cauliflower's throat. Rashid's quick resentment surrendered to the contagious mirth, and he joined his friend in a cleansing emotion older than time. When there was nowhere else to go, laughter was a healing escape. Afterward, Cauliflower tactfully retreated into silence, affording Rashid the privacy he needed to focus on his next course of action. He studied the empty glass in his hand and attempted to envision the path he must walk. Fatigue made strategizing difficult. The deficit of information he labored under was painfully clear. He knew more about his enemies than he did his own wife. She would not assist him in this area. This he did know. He would proceed as men had been doing since Adam's creation. He would be patient, and patience would reveal what Victoria would not. Soon he would know the heart and soul of this woman, and in the knowing he would find the key to her surrender. Rashid returned his glass to the bar and turned toward his compartment. As he passed by Cauliflower's chair, he paused. Placing his hand on the man's shoulder, he searched for the right words. "You're a brave and loyal man," said Rashid. "Since I was a boy, I've tried to be the prince you have always believed me to be. In this, I think I have succeeded, and I thank you for your counsel and support. But this path I must walk alone, as each man should." Cauliflower answered in a deep, raspy voice. "Good night, Rashid."